Bobcat walks into a hospital room and jumps on a bed. When the patient turns over, everyone gasps. The nurse nearly dropped her clipboard when she saw it, a full-grown bobcat, walking straight through the automatic doors like it belonged there. It wasn't panicked. It didn't growl or run, it just walked slow, calm, deliberate, past the front desk, past the vending machines, straight down the main hallway of Pine Grove Hospital like it had somewhere to be. Was that a bobcat? A receptionist whispered, standing halfway out of her chair. Security was called immediately, but by the time they arrived, the animal had already slipped past 2 wards and entered the East Wing, pediatrics. People froze. No one dared to get too close. But it didn't matter, the bobcat wasn't interested in anyone. Its golden eyes scanned door after door until it stopped. Room 214. The door was cracked open. Inside, 12-year-old Mason Calder had been in a coma for 43 days. A biking accident. Head trauma. No response since the day he was brought in. Machines beeped softly around him, tracking every shallow breath. His mother had stepped out just minutes earlier to take a call. The bobcat pushed its head through the door. No sound, no hesitation. It walked in like it had done it 100 times before. One nurse gasped when she saw it. Another stood frozen in place. They should have run or screamed. But something about the animal's stillness made them stop. The bobcat stepped quietly toward the bed. Then, without warning, it leapt up onto the mattress. One smooth jump, no sound. It padded forward, slow and steady, until it reached Mason's side. And then, unbelievably, it sat, right there beside a child who hadn't moved in over a month. The machines kept beeping. The boy's chest rose and fell. Then it happened. Mason's fingers twitched. One nurse clapped a hand over her mouth. The other stepped back, eyes wide. "Did you see that?" she whispered. The bobcat didn't flinch. It just stared at the boy's face like it was waiting for something. Seconds later, Mason's foot shifted under the blanket. His lips parted. His breath deepened. "Oh my God," someone murmured. Security finally arrived, but no one moved. No one wanted to be the one to chase the animal away. One guard lowered his walkie-talkie and said, Is he waking up?" The bobcat didn't look at anyone. It leaned down, pressed its head gently against Mason's shoulder, and closed its eyes. And then the boy stirred again. The hallway was dead silent except for the slow beep of monitors echoing from behind room doors. Nobody dared speak. The bobcat was still lying on the boy's bed, unmoving, like it was guarding him or waiting. Mason's eyelids fluttered. The nurse closest to the door took a cautious step inside, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mason?" "No." Response. But the boy's fingers twitched again, this time deliberately. Not just a nerve spasm. His hand shifted on the sheet like he was trying to grip something. The bobcat leaned in, its whiskers brushing his arm. And then the boy inhaled, sharper, deeper. "Mason," the nurse said again, her voice cracking. One of the monitors started to change, heart rate slightly elevated, brain activity flickering. The pediatric doctor, Dr. Levin, rushed in seconds later, summoned by a terrified but hopeful intern. He froze the moment he saw the animal. "What in the world?" he started, but the nurse cut him off. "Look," she whispered. "He's responding." Dr. Levin didn't move closer. His eyes darted between the patient and the wild creature lying calmly next to him. "Nobody touch it," he said carefully. "If it feels threatened, it might panic." But the bobcat didn't seem the least bit agitated. It was focused entirely on the child. Occasionally it would tilt its head or shift its ears, as though listening to something no human could hear. Then Mason stirred again. His eyelids didn't just flutter, they opened. The room went still. His gaze was unfocused at first, heavy, confused. Then slowly, so slowly, it drifted toward the animal resting at his side. The bobcat didn't react, but Mason's lips moved. "Rusty," he whispered. Dr. Levin blinked. "Did he just say—" The nurse was already nodding, tears forming in her eyes. "He's conscious." The security team, still standing just outside the door, lowered their radios. One of them mumbled, "I think this just turned into something else." Outside, word spread like wildfire. Not just about the bobcat, but that Mason Calder, the boy who hadn't moved or spoken for weeks, had opened his eyes. People whispered in the hallways. Nurses peeked through the glass window. Phones vibrated with alerts, texts, and disbelief. Mason's mother returned minutes later, breathless. When she saw the scene in the room, her son awake, a wild bobcat. Curled beside him, she froze in place. What is going on?" She rushed to his side, ignoring the animal completely. "Baby? Oh my God, Mason." Mason blinked, weak but aware. "Hi, Mom," he whispered. "Is Rusty okay?" She glanced at the bobcat, still resting calmly on the bed. Her hands trembled. As she touched her son's cheek, "Where did you hear that name?" "He was my best friend," Mason murmured. "When I was little, before we moved." Her heart nearly stopped. Years ago, when Mason was just a toddler, their family had lived in a wooded town up north. There was a young rescued bobcat in a wildlife center nearby. Mason used to visit it almost every weekend. He'd named it Rusty, even though the staff said the cat didn't respond to names. Mason would sit for hours, reading books out loud, near its enclosure. But they'd moved away. The wildlife center had burned down a year later. Mason cried for days. They thought the bobcat had perished. She turned slowly toward the animal on the bed, her mouth dry. "There's no way." But then the bobcat looked at her and let out a soft, familiar chuff. The exact sound she remembered Mason trying to mimic when he was little. Not a growl, not a hiss, a greeting. The hospital staff had no idea what to do. Nurses who had spent decades in the ER whispered like school kids. Doctors leaned in corners, watching through the glass as if witnessing a miracle no textbook could explain. And still the bobcat remained, silent, unmoving, fiercely calm beside the 6-year-old boy it somehow knew. Mason's mother stood frozen, her mind spinning in circles. She remembered the enclosure with the mesh roof, the wooded trail they used to walk, and her son, barely 3 years old, standing on tiptoe to whisper through the fence to a small reddish bobcat he had insisted on calling Rusty. It had been a sweet obsession back then until they moved. And now this, how could it be possible? Dr. Levin gently guided her away from the bed, his voice low. "I don't know what to say. We're still stabilizing his vitals, but his awareness, the connection to the animal, it's like it pulled him back." "I didn't tell him we moved," Mason murmured, his voice barely above a breath. "I promised I'd come back." He glanced at the bobcat, his eyes now brimming with recognition. "I think Rusty waited." The room went silent. One of the security guards finally spoke. "Okay, but how in the world did a bobcat walk through automatic doors, climb stairs, navigate a hallway, and find this exact room?" Nobody had an answer, not one that made sense, at least. Later that afternoon, an animal behaviorist named Dr. Naomi Reyes arrived at the hospital. She had driven 2 hours after receiving a call from Dr. Levin. Though skeptical, she agreed to observe, from a safe distance at first. She sat behind the glass with her notebook, watching the creature lying next to Mason like a living statue. No signs of aggression, no anxiety, just a presence. "I've worked with rescued big cats for years," she said finally, turning to Mason's mother. "Some remember specific voices, gestures, or faces, especially if they were cared for during early development. But this," she shook her head slowly, "this goes beyond learned behavior." As night fell, a soft hush covered the room like a blanket. Mason drifted in and out of sleep, his breathing more stable. The bobcat didn't move from his side. Once, nurses offered food and water in a shallow tray, but the cat barely acknowledged it. It was as though it wasn't here for survival, it was here for someone. By morning, hospital administration had been forced to act. Regulations were clear, wild. Animals weren't permitted in medical facilities, no matter how docile they appeared. But no one wanted to be the one to remove Rusty. Not just because of Mason, but because there was an unspoken fear. What if they broke something sacred? Dr. Reyes proposed a compromise. A wildlife transport team would arrive by evening to conduct a safe transfer. In the meantime, she would supervise and ensure nothing escalated. Everyone agreed reluctantly. Everyone except Mason. "You can't take him," he whispered, gripping his mother's hand. "He came to see me. What if I never see him again?" She brushed his hair gently. "Honey, Rusty's a wild animal. He doesn't belong in a hospital, but he belongs with me." That one sentence cracked something deep in her chest. Around noon, an unexpected visitor arrived. A man in a worn ranger jacket with a Wildlife Rehabilitation Center logo faded across the chest. He introduced himself as Thomas Granger. His voice was calm and his face was familiar. "I used to run the Wildlife Center upstate, the one that burned." Mason's mother's eyes widened. "You knew the Bobcat?" Granger nodded. "He wasn't supposed to survive. We had 10 animals that day. We could only rescue 4. Rusty was the smallest, scared of everything except Mason." He stepped closer to the window and looked at the Bobcat. "I read the hospital report. I didn't believe it until now." "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Granger's eyes didn't leave Rusty. "We let them say goodbye. But maybe this time it won't be the end." What he didn't say but felt deep in his bones was this: some animals don't just remember. They wait. Against all odds, against every natural instinct. They remember love, and sometimes they come back for it. As the afternoon light softened, and the fluorescent buzz of the hospital seemed to dim beneath the quiet gravity in room 214, Mason lay sleeping, his small hand barely curled on the blanket. Rusty remained at his side, his breathing calm, tail gently flicking now and then. It had been hours, but still no one had dared to remove him. Not because they couldn't, but because no one wanted to break whatever invisible thread tied this wild creature to the fragile boy in the bed. Dr. Reyes watched closely from the other side of the glass, making careful notes but struggling to explain what she was seeing. In her years of observing animal behavior, she had encountered fear, aggression, playfulness, confusion, but never this. This wasn't instinctual survival or environmental imprinting. It was presence, a choice. She leaned forward, watching, as Rusty gently lowered his head against the boy's side, like a guardian keeping vigil. Granger returned with a file from the old Wildlife Center archives. He spread the faded documents on a table in the hallway. Photographs, intake logs, behavior reports. There, among the papers, was a photo, one that hit Mason's mother so hard she had to sit down. A small Bobcat kit curled beside a toddler's, shoe, both of them asleep in the grass, safe, unaware of the world beyond the sanctuary's fence. The name scribbled at the bottom: Rusty and Mason, May 2019. Granger glanced up. They were inseparable for months. After the fire, we lost track of many of the animals. We assumed Rusty didn't make it, but somehow he did, and he remembered. Inside the room, Mason stirred. His eyes fluttered open and landed on Rusty immediately. His face lit up with a weak smile. "You stayed," he whispered. That whisper changed everything. Monitors beeped, in quiet rhythm. A nurse stepped into the room slowly, moving with practiced grace, checking IV levels, making brief notes on the chart. She paused when she saw Mason reaching a hand toward Rusty's ear, the Bobcat still unmoving, calm, as if he knew exactly how fragile the boy beside him was. When she stepped back out, her eyes were wet. He hasn't had that kind of strength in days, and the color in his face, it's coming back. Something's happening, something good, but the spell couldn't last forever. The wildlife transport team had arrived. They came quietly, respectfully, carrying sedation tools and transport, crates built for wild animals. Granger met them at the hospital entrance, his tone calm but firm. "He's not aggressive, he's not a threat, he's just here, for a reason. Let's not make this harder than it has to be." As the team approached the room, Mason's mother stood outside, torn between doing what was expected and what her son desperately needed. She looked at Granger. "If we take him now, Mason will know. He'll feel it. It might undo everything." Dr. Reyes spoke softly. "There's something you should see." She turned her tablet toward the group and played a short clip from the room's monitoring camera. Mason awake, whispering to Rusty, and the Bobcat responding with a low chuffing sound. Not a growl, not distress, but recognition, affection. It wasn't just a one-sided memory. One of the wildlife techs, a younger man with sunburned cheeks and steady hands, watched the video and lowered his gear. "I don't think I can be the one to do this," Granger sighed. "Let's give them one more night." Inside, the sun dipped below the window, casting soft golden light across the bed. Mason was awake now, talking gently to Rusty, as if nothing in the world was out of place. His mother stood in the doorway, watching her son come back to life, one word at a time. It had been so long since he had spoken without exhaustion, smiled without pain. Outside the room, nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. It was then that Dr. Reyes made a quiet decision. She turned to the nurse and said, "Mark this as observation under medical supervision. No removal unless the situation changes." And just like that, The boy and his bobcat were given one more night, one more chance for something neither science nor policy could fully explain. What they didn't know was that this night would change everything, because by morning, something far more miraculous would unfold, and the hospital would never be the same again. The hospital was quiet in the early morning hours, the fluorescent hum softened by the hush that settles over places where people fight for life and others wait breathlessly for hope. In room 214, however, something extraordinary was unfolding. Mason was awake. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't just opening his eyes in brief, flickering moments of confusion or pain. He was talking, whispering even, his voice still thin but steady. His mother sat by his side, clutching his hand, struggling not to cry as she listened to him tell Rusty about the dream he had, how they used to run through trees and hide behind rocks and sleep under the stars. He spoke of the fire that separated them, though Mason could barely remember what had happened to him after. But what mattered now, what made tears pool in his mother's eyes, was that Mason remembered Rusty, not just as a wild animal or a friend, but as family. Rusty sat beside him still, eyes half closed, body calm, a silent guardian. Word of Mason's improvement spread quickly through the hospital. Doctors who had watched his vitals drop to dangerous lows were now stunned by the reversal. Dr. Reyes stared at the monitors, double-checked the blood pressure, logs, the oxygen saturation. It didn't make sense medically. Children didn't just rebound like this. But somehow Mason had found strength when there should have been none left. She didn't speak the thought out loud, but deep down she believed. The Bobcat had something to do with it. Not through magic, but through something far more powerful. Connection. Granger arrived early, carrying coffee in one hand, and the familiar sense of worry that had followed him since the moment Rusty walked through the automatic doors. He stepped into the room quietly, his presence unnoticed at first as Mason laughed, an actual laugh when Rusty let out a low, soft chuff. Granger blinked. That sound. That was the same sound Rusty had made when he was just a cub, the same one he used when approaching those he trusted. "Hey there, bud," Granger said gently, and Mason looked up. "I know you," the boy whispered. "You had the other animals, you helped us." Granger knelt down beside the bed. "And I remember you. You were always the one sneaking extra fruit to the foxes when no one was looking." Mason smiled. It was faint, but it reached his eyes. There was silence for a moment. Then his mother asked the question she'd been dreading. "What happens now?" Granger's eyes dropped to the floor. "The sanctuary. They want Rusty back. And legally he's still considered wildlife. He's not supposed to be here, but—" He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Sometimes rules have to follow reason, and what's happening here? It defies explanation." Dr. Reyes entered then, glancing at Granger before gently announcing, "The board's meeting this morning. There's concern, of course, but also awe. The ethics committee wants to talk. People from the state have been notified." Mason's mother stiffened. "They're not taking him away today, right? He just got better. You can't take him. Now, no one's doing anything yet," Reyes promised, "but we'll have to be ready for every outcome." That day tests were run, blood drawn, imaging scans reviewed, and with each result the same message echoed through the hospital halls. Mason was recovering. In fact, he was improving faster than anyone had predicted. His immune response had stabilized. His neurological scans showed promising signals. Even the paralysis they now believed might not be permanent. And through it all, Rusty never left his side. That evening, just after sunset, Dr. Reyes called a meeting with Granger, Mason's mother, and a small team of physicians, psychologists, and ethical advisors. It was time to make a decision. "There's no precedent for this," she admitted, "but we have to acknowledge what's in front of us." The boy's recovery began the moment Rusty appeared, not just biologically but emotionally. His stability, his improvement, they're intertwined with Rusty's presence. A heated discussion followed. Liability concerns, animal safety, human safety. But through every argument, one truth kept returning. Rusty wasn't acting like a typical wild animal. He was acting like a protector. And Mason wasn't just improving, he was healing. Back in the room, Granger sat with Mason as the boy told him a story. A made-up adventure involving a boy and his bobcat exploring a canyon, finding hidden caves, and discovering a glowing rock that healed anything it touched. Mason's voice was filled with wonder and softness. He had forgotten his pain for a moment. The door opened, Dr. Reyes entered quietly. "They've made a decision," she said. "Rusty can stay until Mason is discharged. After that, a team from the sanctuary will evaluate next steps." Mason's mother exhaled, part relief, part anxiety. "At least that buys us time." Rusty turned his head toward Dr. Reyes and blinked. Slowly. The final days at the hospital were filled with moments no one expected. Mason walking with assistance, Rusty pacing beside him like a shadow, nurses pausing in the hallway to listen to the soft laughter echoing from room 214. And every time Mason's hand brushed Rusty's fur, the monitors picked up a rhythm doctors couldn't explain but came to trust. Calm, steady, alive. On the day of Mason's discharge, the hospital staff lined the hallway. A nurse pushed his wheelchair. His mother held a small bag of belongings. Rusty walked beside them wearing a soft, padded harness, not to restrain, but to show cooperation. Outside, the sun was warm and bright. Granger stood at the curb. A special vehicle arranged to take them both to a transitional home near the sanctuary, one with both medical facilities and a private, secure space for Rusty to live, monitored, yes, but never caged. Before getting in, Mason looked up at his mother. "Mom," he whispered. "He didn't forget me." "No, baby," she said, choking back tears. "He found you." As the doors closed, Dr. Reyes stood back and murmured to herself, "Sometimes the wild saves us." It wasn't just a reunion. It wasn't just survival. It was a reminder that even in silence, even across years and species and scars, some bonds refuse to break.